Good evening, and welcome to Talking Volumes. I'm Stephanie Curtis, Director of Programming for NPR News. From COVID 19 to climate change to the economic downturn to injustices in our policing and legal system, the most pressing issues we face in America are disproportionately affecting people of color. So, for this series, we're bringing together a diverse group of authors to talk about their books, which all provide unique insights on America's racial divide. We have poets Reginald Dwayne Betts and M. Scott Momaday, and novelists Chang Ray Lee and Naima Coster. You can get more information on the series, links to local booksellers, and tickets to all Talking Volumes events at mprevents.org. Tonight, we will have a 60-minute in-depth interview with the author, followed by a panel discussion presented by our partners at Star Tribune. If you haven't had a chance, check out the author profile at startribune.com. You can also listen to the radio broadcast of this interview on NPR News Friday at 9 a.m. We'd like to thank our generous sponsors, Thomson Reuters, for their support. Now, please welcome award-winning journalist and your host for this evening, Kerri Miller.
Welcome to a special winter series of Talking Volumes. I'm Kerri Miller. I can't think of a better moment for an expansive conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Scott Momaday. What can poetry reveal to us about enduring our continued isolation in this pandemic? Can it awaken us anew to the inequities that persist? Can it sharpen our senses to the beauty of the world around us? Can it soothe the fear and the suspicion that animates so much of our political and social debate? Mr. Momaday writes in the introduction to his new collection of poems titled The Death of Sitting Bear, a poem is a moral statement concerning the human condition composed in verse. We're going to talk about that and a lot more. Scott Momaday, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Kerri. I'm pleased to be here.
Scott, I feel like that's a rather tall order for poetry, a moral statement concerning the human condition. And I think too many people think of poetry as kind of quaint and quiet and serene. Make the case for the necessity of poetry in a rough and tumble world that feels like, the velocity is accelerating every couple of months, that it's a place that it's hard to get our hands around. Where does poetry fit into that?
Well, I guess I would say that poetry is universal. You can write a poem about anything, as far as I know. And I define poetry, and I think you read the definition, a poem as a statement concerning the human condition composed in verse. And the important element in that definition is the word verse, because poetry is verse, it's measured, as opposed to prose, say, or other kinds of writing. So that's the distinction. And you can write about. I've wrote a poem not long ago about the pandemic, and so anything is possible in poetry, I think.
How
There's no
did you,
bounds.
in writing about the pandemic and the human condition that so many of us are experiencing in many different ways, how did you set about capturing what this feels like to so many different people, what our own internal read of it is, and then how chaotic the world seems outside with this? How do you think about coming to grips with that?
I feel that it is my duty to write about something. If I choose the subject of the pandemic, for example, I write about it to the best of my knowledge. Take a point of view. I had read something about the discovery of a plate, a ceramic plate in London, which was very old, and it read, "We are the Earth." And I think it was written during the Black plague. And so I took that as my starting point and talked about the people the people of the plate. That seemed to me a wonderful metaphor. And so I developed a poem around that, talked about the sadness of people involved in that epidemic, and how they must have felt about it. And for someone to inscribe on a plate, "We are the earth," it seems to me that it might have been written by a young man to his beloved, say, and he was talking to her about, well, the end is near, and we have to face that, and this is part of the agony that we are living through now. So that's basically the substance of the poem.
What has the isolation and the solitariness of the pandemic been like for you? I mean, are these moments when you use that kind of reality anyway to write some of your best poetry, and so this hasn't felt all that different? Or have you felt quite alone, and maybe that's been difficult to get back to work?
I felt a little alone, but the fact of the matter is I work at home, always have, and so it's not the isolation is probably not as obvious to me as it is to many people. I don't get out much, but then I don't have the need to get out. I write at home and have everything I need here to write, and so I'm always finding inspiration in what I read or what I hear on the news and so on. So I really am quite comfortable writing at home.
So you feel, even in your usual practice before the pandemic, you feel you have a certain sense of isolation within your home, but you do feel connected to what is happening in the world around you, and it sounds like you feel, a driving interest to write about that connection and those events. Is that right?
That's a fair statement. Yes. I keep up with the news. I listen to the news regularly, so I'm aware of what is happening in the world. But it's all in my, it comes to me where I sit at home, and I have the materials I need for writing. I have the research materials and so on. So I have very little need actually to get out.
I wondered if you feel that the power of your imagination, and you've said that this is the way you've worked for a long time, that the power of your
Yes.
imagination has changed over the years, that you find yourself in places through your imagination that are unexpected.
Well, the imagination has always been a very important part of my life, even as a child. I'm an only child, and so I had to shift for myself much of the time, and I developed an imagination. I imagined a friend. I had imaginary friends, and I was very fortunate in that I had a horse, and I rode over the canyon country of New Mexico for several years. I lived on the back of the horse, and my imagination took flight because I was engaged in thinking of people I'd read about. Billy the Kid, for example, was a hero of mine, as he is to many people who grow up in New Mexico. But he and I rode the range together, and I wrote about him, and he inspired me in many ways, and that was true of other imaginary characters as well, and imaginary places for that matter.
Sounds like wonderful training for a poet.
I think it was. I think I was very fortunate to be alone on many occasions as a child, and I had to fill the time with my imagination, and that's exactly what I did. And I sharpened it, and over the course of years, I have become more and more interested in the imagination, and I define the imagination as that which enables us to see beyond reality. We see the mountain, for example, there, and it is real, but we imagine the valley on the other side, and that is not real, but it is. It can be made real in the mind, and we can write about it, imagine it.
Sometimes I think the power of the imagination is given kind of short shrift. This idea that if you really want to understand the world, you read nonfiction. You know, fiction, poetry, that kind of thing is for people who have time for that. But serious people, you know, they're immersed in nonfiction. What you've just said about the imagination, of course, challenges that. I'd like to hear you
Yeah, I would
develop that a
challenge
little
that.
more. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the imagination is equally important to the experience of reality. We get enough of that, you know, in our daily news and so on. So we know the facts, we know what happens in the world and so on. What we don't know is what possibility lies beyond the news, beyond understanding the real world. The imagination enables us to see far beyond reality. And to me, that's important. I think it's important to most writers as well.
Right.
But I live a life of the mind, and the imagination is a very important part of that.
I don't want to get away from what you said about Billy the Kid too far here, because I wanted to remember to ask you, what was it about his story and history that was so appealing to you as a kid?
Well, you know, you hear about Billy the Kid if you live in New Mexico because this was his territory, and he was a very exciting figure. He did. He was involved in the most important escape in the history of the West. He escaped from the Lincoln County Courthouse, and he lived for 90 days after that. But I became so interested in him that I've read, you know, many books about him, and I became a kind of aficionado, and I've forgotten a lot of what I knew about Billy the Kid, but at one time I knew quite a bit, and I wrote about it. I wrote about him, and I think of him as you know, he was a boy, and he died very young, and he was a blazing figure in the West, and was terribly exciting in his life, and to hear stories about him, to read about him, that was very exciting. And so he became familiar to me. And I think of him not as a desperado, not as a cold-blooded killer. He was that in part, certainly. He did kill men. But he was basically a boy who was looking for a home. And he never found it. He never found it. He was always on the run. And so he becomes a tragic figure. And the cowboy who died young is a staple in the West. And so it appealed to me as a boy. It appeals to me now, for that matter.
Why? What is appealing about it now?
The excitement of his life, his character, his way of looking at the world, all of the trauma that was forced upon him, the death of his friends, being killed by law people, and so on. So he becomes to me a kind of sympathetic figure. And I know he's not that to most people, but I know more about him than most people do. So I am entitled to think of him as a sympathetic character.
You know, when you describe those rides that you took as a kid and the way your imagination powered those experiences, I wonder if you can imagine doing the kind of writing that you do about the subjects that you write without having had those early experiences on the landscape that you were traveling. Just what it means to have had your landscape of your childhood be the way the territory looks in New Mexico, to have had that experience, how that infuses your experience as a writer even today. Can you imagine doing the kind of work you do if you hadn't had that?
No, no, I don't think anyone can. We write out of our experience. That's all we have. And so I had the experience of the Wild West when I was a boy. I was fortunate to see the landscape of in the same landscape that Billy the Kid saw and other people. But that was a part of my experience, and there's no way to account for anything that I write that is not grounded in that experience. I've traveled over much of the world too, and I have, I've written about Russia, for example, and Siberia and other places where I have been, and those experiences are invaluable to me. I can't imagine my life without them, and I think I don't have a life without them, as a matter of fact. So they're there and they're real, and so they inform much of my writing. And you can have, the experience, while it's real, can also feed the imagination, and you can impose the imagination upon a given landscape. For example, I was several years ago able to spend some time in Samarkand in Uzbekistan. Wow. It's ancient city, and of course, it was exciting to me to be there, and that's the kind of thing that you can write about, and you can write about it as a physical place of structures, houses, and so on. But beneath that, you start imagining the life of Tamerlane, for example, who lived in Samarkand, and then you have a whole new dimension that is available to you as a writer.
It sounds very nourishing for the imagination, going to these different places, but also maybe giving you a new dimension to the way you see the landscape that you come back to. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right.
I wondered if
Kerri,
go ahead.
We have what we call an apperceptive mass, which is the totality of our experience, and that mounts up. You acquire more and more experience as you grow older, and all of that is fodder for the imagination and for the writing for the invention of writing about it.
Are there some things that you knew that you wanted to write about in your life, but you thought that will take a certain maturity, that will take a certain level of experience? I think of this as the way that actors say, to play King Lear, you have to have accrued a lot of stage experience and life experience. And I wonder if it's the same for poets.
I think it is. Yes. You think of a subject and you say, "Oh, that's very interesting to me. I wonder if I can write about it." And so you start, building the possibility in your mind, and eventually you can write about it. I think in most instances, anyway. That's been my experience. I'm writing something now is interesting to me because I'm just into it and finding out more about it. But my ancestors probably came from Siberia or Asia, crossing the Bering Bridge in the period of the last ice age, and then migrating from the northern part of what is now the United States down to the southern plains, which became their destination. And they built a life there. They acquired horses, and their life was changed remarkably. And it was a very exciting life during their golden age. They were people of great adventure and color. So I'm writing about that, and I find that I have a blood memory, if I may put it that way. I remember things that happened before my time. I think that something that exists in most of us, though maybe we don't know it. But my grandmother, for example, could talk about places where she had never been. It's a blood memory. And I think it's passed down by means of story. She tells stories, and for example, I'm writing about the migration of the Kiowa people, and I have heard stories about their migration, though it wasn't something that I made. I didn't make the migration myself, but I have information about it, and I can take my imagination and torsion it so that I understand what that was in a way, and I can write it down.
I think many of us would love to know how to access that blood memory, because I think that makes sense to us, that we carry, if not the genes and the epigenetics, right, the experiences of our ancestors and our own DNA,
Yes.
we carry also that kind of sensibility about who our ancestors were. But you sound like you are much more in touch with that than many of us are, or know how to
Well, I may
be.
be because it's something that interests me, and I concentrate upon it. I try to find out as much about the process of writing out of the blood memory, so that it becomes more and more familiar to me, easier in a way to do as I go along. You mentioned genes, and another word for blood memory is genetic memory. It's in our blood, and we can. There's more there than we know, and we can collect it at times if we want to.
How much of that do you think is influenced by the stories that your grandmother told you, stories that she witnessed, but also that she heard and believed, she could access through this genetic memory? How do you think that what you perceive as this blood memory is being influenced by that?
I think there are all kinds of influences upon the blood memory. It comes about if you see something that looks strangely familiar to you, and you think, I must have been there. I must have been there at some time in a previous life. I have an interesting experience to tell you about. I was in 2008 going across Siberia on the Trans-Siberian Railroad through 9 time zones. It's a huge mass of land. And one night I had a compartment to myself on the train. It was a lovely train. And I went to bed. I went to sleep. And I was awakened by the stopping of the train. And I looked out my window, and we had come to a little station, and there were yellow lights in a kind of foggy night. And it was eerie looking. And anyway, a young man boarded the train and came to my compartment. He was a soldier. He was a very nice-looking, straight young man. And I gave him the papers of entry. We had entered Mongolia. And I gave him the papers I had filled out in advance, the papers of entry. And as I looked at him, I had a strange feeling. I thought, I know this man. And I have been here before, 30,000 years ago. And so I had returned to a place of origin as far as I was concerned. It was exciting to me.
Makes you wonder whether he had a sensation of that. I mean, some kind of recognition as well, but he was not as in tune with his genetic memory as you are, right?
Probably so, unless he was a writer, perhaps, or someone who was invested in his own imagination. I imagine it was dull work for him collecting these papers on getting on the train and then off and filing them and so on. That wasn't exciting, but to me it was exciting.
Right. I mean, nowhere near as dramatic and impressionable for him as it was for you.
Probably not. I guess not. Yeah.
Do you think that through epigenetics and through some of this blood memory that we're talking about, that we carry what we can think of as messages somehow from our ancestors deep back into our familial history.
I think so. I think we can understand. We can be in touch with our ancestral heritage and learn from people who lived generations before we did. We do. Yeah, I think they teach us things. I can imagine living in the camps during that migration of the Kiowas down the Cordillera of North America, and imagining living in the teepee, seeing people, every day, and I talk to them. And they inform me with lessons of life. They give me information that helps me to get through things. And I think that happens to all of us, though we probably don't think of it in that way.
That would also mean, though, that we carry the sadness and the trauma of our ancestral lines as well, doesn't it?
Yes.
I mean, that is kind of what epigenetics is about. Yes.
Yeah. When I think of my ancestral heritage, I think of they acquired horses. They were great hunters and fighters, and the golden age was about 100 years, and that's a very short period of time in the long range of history. But at the end, their culture fell apart. The buffalo were killed. The Sundance was prohibited. The horses were gone, and so it was a very sad time, and that's part of the trauma that I think you're talking about. And I do experience that, yes, and I feel a sadness when I think of that. But there it was, and what do you do with it? Well, you make the most of it. You write about it if you can, and it's a story.
I've talked about this with writer David Troyer about not seeing Native American, the sadness, the trauma of Native American history as the sum total of the story to be told about Native Americans. How do you think about the way so much of Native American history is perceived?
I think very few people are knowledgeable about Native American culture. There it is, and we tend to gloss over it. It's less important to us than Black experience, say. The Native American has been largely invisible, but when I write about my ancestors, I understand several things, that are true, that they did live a very exciting life for a time. That their period of their golden age was a time of great valor and courage and excitement. And they enjoyed it to the hilt, as I enjoy thinking about it myself. It's gone, but there it is, and we can't overlook it because it is a part of our experience. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what occurs to me.
And at the beginning, you said often the Native American history is overlooked. What do you think the reason for that is?
Well, the American Indian was in the way of westward progress and manifest destiny, and so they were swept away and forgotten. They were overcome. They were overpowered, and so they became prisoners of war. And that period of their life, the period following their great golden age, is a story of abject poverty and the killing of the spirit is marked by depression and defeat. And that they have yet to overcome that. They're making great strides, but it's still there. And that is why, the Native American, his infant mortality is greater than the rest of the world's, and the rate of suicide is terrible, hunger, poverty. So we don't like to look at things like that, and we push them out of our minds. And so the American Indian has been overlooked in that sense. He'll emerge again, I'm sure, but for the time being, he has a lot to overcome.
This might be a good moment for a poem, if you are willing to read one of the poems that you've selected. And if you would tell us a little bit about the poem that you chose, and then maybe I could read one from your new collection as well.
Great. Like that. Well, the poem that I will read is called Plainview 1. I think I wrote 4 poems with that title, Plainview 1, 2, 3, 4. And it is a description of the landscape of the southern plains. And it goes like this. There in the hollow of the hills I see 11 magpies stand away from me. Low light upon the rim, a wind informs this distance with a gathering of storms, and drifts in silver crescents on the grass, configurations that appear and pass. There falls a final shadow on the glare, a stillness on the dark, erratic air. I do not hear the longer wind that lows among the magpies. Silences disclose until no rhythms of unrest remain. 11 magpies standing in the plain. They are illusion. Wind and rain revolve, and they recede in darkness and dissolve. So that's a sonnet, actually, and it's native couplets. Pretty exact rhyme and carefully constructed. That's the way I like to write.
It's wonderful. I feel like in listening to that, every one of my senses is engaged in the visualization, the imagery that you've used.
No, I wish I could quote you and keep the quote. Thank you.
You are most welcome to that. All right. I have chosen, this is kind of fun that we go back and forth on reading your poetry. This is The Snow Mare. In my dream, a blue mare loping, pewter on a porcelain field, away. There are bursts of soft commotion where her hooves drive in the drifts, and as dusk ebbs on the plain of night, she shears the web of winter, and on the far side, blind side, she is no more. I behold nothing, wherein the mare dissolves in memory, beyond the burden of being. Again, every sense engaged in thinking about that poem. Will you tell us a bit about the conception of it?
It's a poem about the loss of someone who was very dear to me. And so I use the metaphor of the mare, the snow mare, and the setting of winter, which is a kind of elegiac time. So it is an elegiac poem in my mind, and I loved to hear it. I appreciate your reading it, and I was about to say I wish I'd written that, but in fact I did.
You did. There's also that sense of deliberate, I'm sure, of this receding image that is obscured, kind of clouded as it drifts away. Does that make sense, that comes to mind?
Yes, exactly. The mare disappears in the fog of the scene of winter, and it is no more. But you've seen it, and it was worth seeing.
And it was powerful in the seeing and
Mm-hmm.
memorable.
Thank you, yes.
There is another poem that I guess feels a little bit like it's in conversation with the Snow Mare. It's called After Image. May I read this?
Of course.
All right.
Please.
After Image. Then I passed the open door, and then the after image of a presence in the room. In the instant it regarded me, and I had been memorized, burdened forever by something in whose sight or sightlessness I should remain beside myself. My deepest self without my reach, ahead the cold of the corridor, and the after image adhering. That is so magnificent. Can you tell us a little bit about the building of that poem?
It's based upon something that actually happened when I was in Greenland, and I was living in an old people's home, a Quonset hut in Chronic, which is the original Tula. And one night I was walking down the corridor in this building in which there were maybe 8 or 10 old people. They were past their prime and they had to be taken care of. And I looked in an open door as I was going, and I saw this woman sitting on her bed, and it was a strange sight because she seemed to be looking at me, but there was looking at me without expression. And there was something very strange about her, very powerful in my mind. It was scary. She scared me. She frightened me, and so I wrote the poem. But that's what happened in the poem. So
I'm struck by how vivid that experience is to you.
yeah,
You
yeah.
remember
Well,
light,
I remember
shadow.
if you had seen this woman and her expression as she looked at you, her eyes were black and very bright, and there was the blackness seemed to fill the whole eye. It was just, there was no center to it. It was just an opaque expression, and one that was very powerful to me. It affected me very much.
Still
And I was glad to
does.
get past that door and go elsewhere. But it stayed in my mind and still does.
You have one more selection that you would
Yeah,
read for us? Wonderful.
well, I have a poem here which is called "A Bear," and it is a poem that I wrote when I was a graduate student at Stanford, and it is the first poem that really gained attention for me. It was awarded the Academy of American Poets Prize, and it's one of which I am very proud. So it's called "A Bear." What ruse of vision, escarping the wall of leaves, rending incision into countless surfaces, would cull and color his somnolence, whose old age has outworn valor, all but the fact of courage. Seen, he does not come, move, but seems forever there, dimensionless, dumb, in the windless noon's hot glare. More scarred than others these years since the trap maimed him, pain slants his withers, drawing up the crooked limb. Then he is gone, whole, without urgency, from sight, as buzzards control, imperceptibly, their flight.
You said that it's a poem you're very proud of. You remember working on it. Is the experience of the creation of some of these poems and the memory of that sometimes as important as the poem itself? Do you know what I'm asking? The way you
I think
worked.
so.
Yeah.
I think so. It is not the destination, but the journey that really counts. So it's the writing of the poem taking it step by step, syllable by syllable. There's a great feeling to that if you can construct something of minute particles and come up with a whole that is what you wanted it to be. I think of poetry as being so much the crown of literature that to have written one poem is worth doing. If I could only write one poem in my life, I think it would be a great satisfaction, and I would feel that I had done what I was meant to do. So that's how I look at poetry. And this poem, for example, "The Bear," it seems to me that I spent a lot of time. I don't remember exactly how much time now, but I was very serious about it, clearly, because you can look at the structure of it and you can see the various parts and how they come together, the exact rhymes, the invariable syllabic length of the line. And you can say to yourself, wow, that's an intricate poem, an intricate poem. And to have written it is a great satisfaction. I look back on it and I say, I wrote that poem, and therefore I have done something.
What's marvelous about it is, for as intricate as it is, it also sounds effortless. For as much work as you must have invested in that, in some ways, I think we, the reader and the listener, that work is obscured in maybe the best way. Does that make sense? I can see you laboring over that beautiful poem, but when I hear it flow from you and I think about reading it for myself and the images, it feels very effortless. Maybe that's the contradiction of the best poetry.
Well, no, I think that's probably the way you should feel about a poem that is that you admire, you take joy in reading. Yeah, as I think back on poetry that I have admired and that has inspired me, that is the sense, that is the feeling that frequently comes to me. Oh, it's a wonderful poem, and it seems so effortless. It seems to have come. I can't imagine Wallace Stevens writing "The Snowman," for example, without the feeling that just flows. It's wonderful. Everything is in place there. It happened. It must have happened automatically, easily.
Right. I mean, it's true. Like in the finest poetry, maybe in the finest literature, there is a kind of inevitability about the story. Like it is inevitable that this story would have begun here and this poem would have reached this center place and that this is how it would have culminated. But I mean, there is a lot, you know better than I, so much labor that goes into that sense of, but this is the way the story was meant to be told.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And at other times, the story seems so spontaneous,
Right.
that you think that has been waiting there to be told.
Right.
I was lucky enough to come upon it and I tell it, but it was there. It's been there for centuries, like the Mongolian soldier in the train, and thinking that I know this man, I've seen him, I know him, I've been here before. That feeling is very spontaneous. It's the accumulation of something that has been around for thousands of years. You happen upon it and you make something of it.
And that's what I'm curious about, is whether there are poems that you begin to write that feel like they have been constructed over a long time And you are now ready to put to paper this construction that has been in your imagination and your mind for a long time. Or maybe most of the poems you write feel like that. How
I
is
think,
that?
yeah, to some degree, most of them do feel like that. You write a poem, and it's not easy to write a poem. A poem demands a lot of you, just by its nature, and so you put a lot of work into it. And when you've finished, you have this feeling that, well, it was there, and simply I simply arranged the words that were drifting around in the air for thousands of years. I simply arranged them in some sensible way, and that's what they were waiting for. They were waiting for me to arrange them, you know. So that's the writing of a poem.
So, what is more satisfying, that a poem that feels like it has been forming for a long time comes out easily, or one that, maybe as with The Bear, you labored over and you worked syllables and you came back to it again and again, and it was ready when it was ready? Which one feels more gratifying as the poet?
I think I have to say that no poem comes easily. No poem comes easily. Poetry demands a great deal of you, and when you write a poem, you come to the end of it. You are exhausted in a way. You understand that you've spent a lot of yourself in the process, and so there is that. And it doesn't come easily. But if it comes well, you know, I once had a professor who said, write little and write well. And that's good advice. You know,
What does it mean?
it means that you shouldn't squander your language on the page. You should think about it very carefully. You must craft it very carefully. You must fit every word into place carefully. You do that, you write little, but you write well. And that's a good motto. I give that to every student who wants to become a writer. It's good advice.
Did you learn the Kiowa language as a boy? Did you grow up knowing or having been taught that by your grandparents or your parents?
No, the truth of the matter is that I don't know Kiowa. I didn't live among the Kiowas long enough to learn the language. My father was fluent, and he passed on to me a lot of, especially the oral tradition of the Kiowas. He told me stories when I was very little, and they made a great impression upon me. But we moved from Oklahoma, where the Kiowas are, during the Depression when I was born. My parents were looking for work, and so they found it on the Navajo reservation in New Mexico, and we moved to Shiprock, and lived on the Navajo reservation at several places for the next few years, and so I actually know more Navajo than Kiowa.
Really?
And and Navajo is a very difficult language to pronounce and to speak. The Navajos say of it that it is an endless language, and that you have to be a Navajo to speak it, understand it clearly, and there's something to that. But I picked up I got it into my ear when I was a little boy, and so I can pronounce Navajo, which is not easy. I can pronounce many of the words in Navajo that most people who are not Navajo cannot speak, cannot say, cannot form on their tongue.
Right.
You want an example of that?
Yeah, please.
The word for coffee or whiskey, dark water, is todilhil, dark water, and Navajo has a voiceless L, and so you blow the air out on both sides of the tongue as you're saying the word todilhil. That's not easy to do, but you pick
No.
it up. And The word for a Coke machine is total chwasha bagan. And you can hear the bubbling total chwasha bagan means the soda pop, its house. That's the Coke machine.
Here's what I wondered about that is whether the rhythm of these languages, Navajo, maybe hearing your father speak Kiowa, I mean, whether if you look into the way that you put syllables together and you construct a line of verse, that you can still see the influence of having heard and learned these languages as a young boy.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm deeply interested in language, but not. I've had the experience of in graduate school, for example, I had to pass exams in 4 languages.
Wow.
It was just a matter of reading it. You don't learn conversation, but you learn how to read it. That's easier. And so I had French and German and Latin and Spanish. But I'm not interested in language in that way. I'm not interested in acquiring a foreign language so much as I am interested in language in the abstract. Language as a language as an invention of the mind. I love to think about the origin of language. How did language begin? How on earth could we have invented something so complex as language? And I've thought about that a lot. I still think about it. And I read Lewis Thomas has a book called The Fragile Species, and one of his chapters is, I think, communication. And he says, I think I know how language began. We were living in caves. People were living in caves. They were having a hard time communicating with each other. They were grunting and groaning and making signs and so on. And then one day, a neighboring tribe came over the hill to visit, and they brought their children. And suddenly, there was a critical mass of children, and the children played all day long. And at the end of that day, we had language.
Wow.
And that appeals to me because, children learn language at an impossibly early age.
Right.
And they do it because they play with it. They play games with it, and they're not afraid of it. We are afraid of it as we grow older. Language is scary. But children, they pick it up easily. And I remember watching my children grow up and how they acquired language. And it's just a fascinating thing to see. One of my children came up to me one evening and said, "Daddy, is it tomorrow yet?" And that floored me. I didn't know what to do with that. But what was going on in her mind was very exciting. Very exciting.
I think part of the reason, and I've experienced this myself, that I used to be very good with learning language. The older you get, the more difficult it seems to make it stick. And it's a reminder that, something that used to come so naturally now takes work, and that maybe my brain is not as plastic or nimble as I'd like it to be. And that difficulty of learning a different language is just a constant reminder. I'd as many times as I've tried to learn Spanish, it just won't take. And I've given up because it's just a reminder that I used to have that facility and I don't anymore. Does that make sense?
Yes, that happens to us. I have the same experience, the same, I used to be a great speller, for example. And now I've lost a lot of that. And I look at a word and I say, is that really how you spell it? And have I written, I write a word down and look at it and say, I think I better go to the spell check for that. But I used to not have that problem. So it does happen as you grow older.
Maybe this is, I've always been a good speller too, and I took pride in that. And maybe this is the way to humble us in the things that we are most prideful of. I don't know.
Could be, yes.
I wondered if we could close with a poem, and whether you have another selection or whether I could open the book and read something that you would suggest. Which would be best, do you think?
Oh, I think you should read.
What?
I do. I can recite another very short poem.
Please, no. Let's do that. That would be wonderful.
Okay, I have a poem entitled "The Presence," and it goes like this: What presence in the trees does not appear? For nothing in the trees engenders fear. What vagrant presence in the trees draws near? And that's the poem. It's a scary poem.
It is. It's really sinister.
And you know yeah, it's a sinister poem, and the whole poem revolves upon the word nothing. Nothing in the woods nothing in the trees engenders fear. How does it go? Nothing. Anyway, I'm big on the word nothing and the concept of nothing.
Yeah. It's frightening.
It goes like this: Nothing is perfect. It may be the only perfection in the universe. Heavy stuff. Oh,
Yeah. You're working on that.
yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to leave without congratulating you about the award that you've received. Is it from the American Poetry Society?
I think it is. Right, Jill? Yes. And it's the Robert Frost Medal, which is very welcome, and I'm very pleased to have been awarded that prize.
Congratulations. And thank you so much for spending an hour with us.
Well, it's really been a pleasure for me. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
I have too. I wish we were doing this in person, but this is next best.
Yes, it's been fun.
Thank you for joining us tonight for that profound conversation with N. Scott Momaday and now this post-show chat. I'm Jenna Ross, and I write about arts and culture for the Star Tribune. I had the honor of interviewing Mr. Momaday for an article in the newspaper. He's not with us tonight, but I am so pleased about the guest we do have. Winona LaDuke, an internationally known environmentalist, rural development economist, and hemp farmer. She's an Anishinaabe activist and water protector who these days is fighting construction of the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. In fact, you might have seen a photo just this week of actor and activist Jane Fonda protesting that project alongside her. And in addition to all of that, she is an author. Her newest work is To Be a Water Protector. It's a powerful book steeped in history and research that reflects this lifetime of work for which she's known. Thank you, Winona, for being here tonight.
Thank you. That's a generous.
You're welcome. We are hoping that this will feel like a book club-like chat. So those of you watching, if you have questions for Winona, please enter them in the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A button, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. I wonder, after listening to that conversation, Winona, whether we should start with the Southwest, which is such a part of Scott's work, and I understand you lived there for some time.
Yeah, I really enjoyed watching the interview, you know, with Scott. You know, I mean, I do know him, and he and I have shared some similar terrain as a young woman. You know, I was raised in a small town in Southern Oregon. You know, and I come from a good family. I really liked listening to him talk about his childhood because I understand that. I had a little imaginary friend too. And I was an only child too for many years of my parents, you know, and then I moved to a small town with my mom and I spent a lot of time outside, you know, and I do think it forms people, you know, and you have this, you know, imagination and you spend all your time in this world, I really resonated a lot of things, and I did spend a lot of time in the Southwest. Last time I saw him was there in Santa Fe. He and I have both favored. There's a native-owned hotel called Hotel Santa Fe. Have you ever been there?
I haven't.
Oh, so great. When I used to fly, I used to like to go to Santa Fe, and I would see him, and I had a little meal with him about a year ago, right there in that hotel. So it was so nice to see that interview now
Oh,
with him. And I had wondered how he was doing, you know.
yeah,
Um,
it seems like sharp as a tack and seems to be doing well.
Yes,
Um,
but it's interesting because things that he talks about are very similar for me. I mean, he's like, I write in the morning, so do I. You know, I don't know. I don't know how you think about it, but sometimes I feel like if you get up really early, that if there's some ideas out there, maybe you can catch them, you know?
I was super curious about that, your writing practice, because given all that you do, where do you fit in the time? And what kind of relationship does your writing have to your activism and vice versa?
Yeah, no, I mean, I write early in the morning generally. I feel like that, and a lot of times I think I like if I sometimes I'm writing late at night, like people like they're like, oh, why you don't quit? I said, because I like to write. I mean, I actually really like to write. And so, but early in the morning, that's my sharpest time.
Mm,
And, but sometimes I'm working on it in my sleep, which I'm sure other writers do. You're kind of like, it's like a puzzle, writing as a puzzle, community organizing as a puzzle, fighting bad guys as a puzzle. So you're working on the puzzle and you wake up and you're like, oh, I got how to tell that story. And so you just launch off in your best, a lot of times with the old pen, start with the pen and then move on from there. But also then there's nobody who calls you really early, right? And your
strategic.
and your children or your grandchildren or whatever guests have arrived at your house are not usually up, so you don't have to, you can just kind of sit in your fluffies and write. Yeah, but I enjoy that time. I mean, he talked about it as therapy for sure.
Mm,
I know, I mean, I started writing for Fargo Forum or the Forum Communications a few years ago, and I really enjoy it. Now I do have a piece that's due now, but it is so hard because you're sitting there and like, on one hand, I'm doing all this, crazy, like out there, like today was a very big day. And yesterday, Jane Fonda came, as you saw. We were
mhm.
down there on the Crow Wing where my ancestors have been for, 10,000 years or something, hanging out. And today I went up by headwaters of the Mississippi. So, it was a very outdoorsy day,
Yeah.
right? And so then you're like, well, when am I going to write? When am I going to finish that little piece? Get right back to it, right? But writing for the
Mhm.
forum, very nice. I like writing therapy. Like I feel like if I wrote something every week, like a meditation,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Mhm.
Like a meditation, then I feel like, okay, at least that story is told best to your ability, right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And so it's
I
meditation, yeah.
Well, I keep thinking about your book, and when I say it in my head, add a word to the title and say how to be a water protector. And I wonder, it sort of feels like that, like a guide and an inspiration. Did you see it that way? Was that part of its purpose?
It wasn't really, to be honest. So it started out with, I mean, as you've read the book, like there's the center chapters are on these really core water protector battles we have experienced here.
Mm-hmm.
There's the Standing Rock section, which we all just watched, in 2016. And then we've had this continuing battle with Enbridge, the Canadian multinational. And so that's kind of the centerpiece of the book, right? And sadly, as you figured out from reading my writing, I like to think about other things besides Enbridge. Jeepers. I spent a lot of time writing all these reports and testifying and writing all, but it ends up as a body of writing,
Mm.
right? So that's the core piece of it. And then as you look around, there's like all these other stories of people that are similar stories, that might be something else. It might be a big mining project or, maybe, so it's really, I think that a lot of times when I'm writing, I really want to kind of give honor to those people
Mm.
who who entrust you with their story. Does that make sense? You know,
Absolutely.
so you do your best, you know, and so that's why it's called that, really, is because a lot of these people are water protectors. Like now they just call us water protectors. I mean, which is a great thing to be. I mean, why wouldn't you want to be a water protector? But all these other people really, you know, a lot of people have been, you know, and so I just want to kind of honor them, you know, in this. And yeah, this started out as a series of like a lot of what I wrote for the Fargo Forum. I mean, the book is like kind of intended to be like my writing, because it's kind of like you know, I mean, I think about the winter counts, old time, you know, people used to keep track of historic events on a buffalo hide. You know this story? I mean, you know, so that and so someone has to keep track of history, right?
Absolutely.
Someone's have to. And so, I mean, you feel compelled to just kind of keep recording it, you know, you know, some people's histories, something.
I was struck by you saying a little earlier that you had in some ways a similar childhood, very connected to the land and to the outdoors. And I wonder, it feels like in Scott's writing, he's making the argument that that attuning sort of to nature, that closeness is what you need to start paying attention. And once you start paying attention to the little place in which you are, you start paying attention to the broader world and things like climate change. I wonder if you see that way, that that personal connection ends up being the source for like larger activism.
Well, I think that land forms you.
Mm.
I mean, I think Scott basically said the same thing. You know, I mean, I was raised in the hills of Southern Oregon, up against, you know, basically, I don't know, 500,000 acres of national forest. That was my backyard. You know, my mother, Betty LeDuc, a really great artist who, you know, an amazing imagination. You know, he's talking about imagination, like all that stuff. But, you know, I'll tell you what, don't mess with the woman when she's in the studio. You're a little kid, bam, you better get out of there. Go run around the woods, right? You know, so I mean, so I have my little imaginary friend, you know, just like Scott did. You know, I mean, you're looking at like, what is it to be a kid that's like on your own and you live in this world that's kind of by yourself, you know, so you have that. I think that what the challenges that we see today are, you know, most people don't even see a dark night. You know, where we live, I see stars. You know, I live, and I'm now raising a bunch of my grandchildren and a bunch of nephews. I'm like this magnet for 14-year-olds. And but we walk at night in the dark. Like, who does that anymore?
Yeah.
Right? We're all like super have to have our light and our electricity and that, you know. So I definitely feel that all of that we've dummied down our senses. I don't want to say anything mean, but you know, like the more electric you get, the more plugged in you get, the more urban you get, the more dependent you get on things. I think you kind of you start losing stuff. You know, you start losing your tactile. Where did you garden? Where did your food come from? How did it smell? You know, what, you know, so I think that, I mean, part of our humanity is being able to be those things. You know what I'm saying? Because we are a reflection of the creator. So I just feel like some of us start with closer, some are, you know, further away, but when we get down to that core, we got some beautiful writing.
Absolutely. And you have this great line about how our land and our water is our life, which feels very rooted in your like family and your native traditions. I wonder if you had to like maybe bring some wisdom from those native traditions out to the broader culture. Are there any in particular that come to mind that you feel like could like heal our relationship to the earth?
Well, you know, let me put it this way. You know, we harvest in the same lake for 10,000 years. That seems like a sustainable economy. You know what I'm saying? I mean, You go to the same maple tree, you can clear cut the forest, but you can get sugar from a tree for the rest of their lives, you know? I mean, you know, certainly we have an experience of living in a world without conquest, you know, and that's really this time is like, if you want to keep trying to pretend like there's something else to conquer, we're done, you know? So I feel like we need to be people who learn how to, I know we need to be people that learn how to recover that relationship, that spiritual covenant with the creator and with all that is around us, because that's how we're better humans. And we get to be, you know, what we, you know, so I feel like, oh, I forgot what you asked me, but anyway, that's what
No, I think you answered it. We have a question here from Virginia who wants to know what nourishes you, which I love that question. What makes you able to continue
Oh, I like that. What
your
nourishes you?
critical
I
work?
mean, life, you know, I mean, what a great life the creator gave us, you know, like my area. Oh, I know. I was talking about what you could learn from us. Okay, so figure this out. This is Ojibwe New Year. Happy New Year to y'all. This is the maple syruping moon. Just started up a little early, but that's the beginning of the Ojibwe New Year. And, you know, so talk about nourishment. That's some good stuff, right? And so when the pandemic hit last year, like, you know, all of a sudden I couldn't fly no more. In fact, I talked to people about it and it sounds like mythical. You know, I used to fly, and my grandchildren all look at me like, wow, I haven't flown for a year, right? You know, I mean, the whole world changed. We'll talk about the pandemic in a minute, but we went to the sugar bush. I was like, well, let's just go in the woods and be Ojibwe. Oh my God, so liberating, you know? And that's pretty nourishing, you know, to go back and be able to go and live the same way as your great, 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 greats did in probably a 300, 400-year-old sugar bush, and make some medicine with, you know, your grandchildren and other people's grandchildren. Talk about like feeling reassured about it. You know, that's my retirement plan. I don't know what yours is, but I don't think my 401k is going to be worth much. I think my grandchildren, they're a better retirement plan. So that's pretty nourishing. Does that make sense? I feel like I invested in my retirement plan, made a bunch of sugar, got out.
And that's fascinating too, because you talk about in your book, this like COVID crisis, this COVID pandemic can also be an opportunity, especially when it comes to the environment. Like, what do you mean by that? Expand on that idea.
Yeah, okay. Arundhati Roy, the Indian writer, you know, she talks about pandemic as portal. Really a really brilliant analogy. You know, I mean, she says that in the history of the world, pandemics have always forced societies to change. This one is no different. You know, it is a portal between one world and the next. And we can drag through that portal our avarice, our hatred, our prejudices, our data banks, our dirty rivers, our bad ideas, or we can walk through clean. That's us. You know, and I think about this because look, you know, none of us in this history thought this was our plan. We was all like cruising along. I was flying around the world, having a great time, you know, doing all this stuff, and all of a sudden, bam, we're down. We didn't do that. We didn't do that, right? You know, that happened, and we had to deal with it, right? The pandemic happened. And so we were forced to change from one world to the next. And in that time, we cut our fossil fuel consumption by 10%. We figured out that our food system don't work because we are like smushing all these vegetables and killing animals. And so we all started gardening, right? I mean, quadrupled sales last year, and it's going to be back, same thing. So we learned to be better people, I think. You know, and we keep praying and mask up, get your vaccination, you know, and don't go back to normal because normal was dysfunctional. Why would you want to do that? Let's be better. Let's have a just transition, a new green revolution. Put some solar up, quit hating on each other. Don't militarize the North, with a bunch of cops coming up here that are paid by a Canadian multinational. Whoa. Minnesota doesn't need that.
I see a question here from John. He would love you to talk a little bit about how the White Earth Land Recovery Project And how is that going these days?
Oh, that's so great. So long time ago, like last century, we started the White Earth Land Recovery Project. And that was because we fought so hard to get back our land and we just cheated out of it. Now it's so interesting. They're talking about land back and land justice. I was like, there's 230,000 acres of the White Earth Reservation held by the federal, state, and county governments. And the Boy Scouts, aren't those guys going bankrupt? They have a big camp on White Earth, Many Point Boy Scout Camp, 2,400 acres. You know, I'm saying we started this project because our land was all stolen and we deserve to have our own land base inside our reservation. We didn't even talk about all of Minnesota. We just talk about, so bought back 1,400 acres of land, all kind of things, sugar bush, farms, and cemeteries. And then in 2013, I walked away from it all. And I just direct the Honor the Earth, and I fight pipelines, sadly. And then I'm working on making solar thermal panels. We have 8th Fire Solar. We're making solar thermal panels because why wouldn't you want to use less energy and be warmer? And growing hemp, so I'm all ready. Roll up my sleeves for the next thing. The White Earth Land Recovery Project is how I started. I think they're still doing good. And I've just kind of like rolled along and here I am.
Yeah, I read a fascinating interview with you that focused on that hemp project. What are your hopes for that? Like, where do you see that going in the next 5-10 years?
It's the new green revolution. What do I mean by that? Well, of course, we all know in Minnesota that Norman Borlaug from the University of Minnesota was the father of the Green Revolution. And we have seen the promise and the devastation, let's just be honest, of industrialized agriculture. And now what we need is the new green revolution, and that is hemp. Because just think about this, anything you can make out of fossil fuels, you can make out of hemp. Henry Ford, in fact, made a car out of hemp, powered by hemp oil. And so what if you built an economy that didn't have any more plastic in it? Because you don't really need anything that lasts 1,000 years like a straw. Who really needs that? Or a disposable diaper? Really, 500 years? Come on. Let's move along. Let's evolve. Go hemp, and it sequesters carbon. Can replace concrete in a lot of construction. My gosh, it could transform the materials economy, and Minnesota needs to be at the top of it. So many more jobs than pipelines. Oh my God. Such a great idea. And we could be the new green revolution. And so that's what I'm working on. I'm all ready. I'm feeling like a new green revolutionary over here.
We have a question from Karen, who is asking about the new Secretary of the Interior, which is a great question, and what your hopes are for Native nations and the environment now that she has been in place.
That is the best thing. I think about this because sometimes a person who has been the most affected by the policies of an agency should actually be in charge of an agency. So a lot of people don't know that inside the Department of Interior is the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs is legally my trustee. I'm legally a ward of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's what it's called to be a federally enrolled Indian. And, we're the only humans in the Department of Interior, Indians and such. But my point is that so is Deb. And now you have someone who has experienced fully the policies of the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs and seen what it is like in communities that are managed with vast areas of land that the Interior Department manages. And so she really has a good eye for that. And so I'm very pleased. And it is about darn time. It is about darn time that Native people were in these positions, because we certainly have a lot of experience with governance, a lot of experience with sustainability, and we have good imaginations, good problem solvers.
I am looking back at the questions, and there's one about blood memory, which Scott talked about at some length, both as like, epigenetics, but also as a form of storytelling or a way of like passing along history. I wonder what you thought about that idea And someone asked specifically, when you talk about intergenerational trauma, you must also talk about intergenerational resilience, is her point. So I just wanted to throw that by you and see.
I love that question. I love that question. So I come from two different kinds of peoples. My mother is Jewish. My mother is Jewish and my father is Ojibwe. Let us just say I have a lot of experience with intergenerational trauma on both sides, right? I feel like I got it. I come from peoples that have been heavily persecuted in their lives and are survivors. I come from survivors, so I feel like I got a survivor's gene in me. I'm like, I'm not gonna squander this one. I'm not supposed to be here really, so I think I'm gonna try to do my best. Right? I mean, you would kind of technically in the big picture of things, right? And within that, like, I think that there's this appreciation for life because I know that basically, long shot. So we're survivors, and then in that though, there's this like set of really interesting instructions. Like my old Ojibwe people, I mean, I live all around them, enough of my people were buried here that this land is us. Right? You live in a land, your body goes back to the earth for 10,000 years, you are the land, right? That's some epigenetics for you right there, right? I mean, it's just like the water. You become the water of the place that you live in. If you're 70% water, you drink the water in the boundary waters, which you can still drink. That's worth fighting for, right? You become that water. So I got all that, all of that. And then I got, funny things. So my grandmother on my mother's side, she was a pocketbook maker in New York. She was a textile worker, union. I come from a union family, union textile workers. And that whole industry was blown out. We don't make textiles in this country. It's offshore to China in the 90s, displacing, globalizing, what's it called? Forever 21, all made in China, sweatshops. You don't need the whole story, but you got it, right? So I got a granny someplace over here saying, get that industry back. She's like, get the textile industry back, Winona. I feel like it. So, my goal is to make canvas bags, luggage, kind of like, but out of hemp canvas, and that's because my grandmother's still bossing me around.
I love that. I too think about like you drawing on your grandmother, and now being a grandmother yourself, which is something Scott Momaday talked about, these 6 grandkids he has now and how he sees the world through their eyes. What has becoming a grandmother meant to you and influenced your life's work?
It's this, it's just so much love. It's so much love. And just, just seeing that intergenerational relationship and how your children are with their children. And then you have your own relationship with them, and my children are not very much into the horses. Let's be honest. But my grandchildren, very much into the horses. Oh, does that ever make me happy? I mean, I have a son. I have raised 4 sons, as a matter of fact, and 2 daughters. My son Ajwak Kapashisa, he's an actor, not a horse guy. He keeps saying, no, I'm not a horse Indian. Don't put me on a horse, But my grandson, he could ride on a horse in any movie. All of them. Yeah, it's a great pleasure having that. And then kind of seeing like, so maybe like, as matriarchs, we like to guide and direct our families. And maybe the lessons didn't get in on that first generation, but then that second generation, they are exactly as you had hoped. And, so maybe it skips and then then my daughter will get, the next round. But the horse kids are great.
Oh, I love that. I think maybe that's a good place to wrap up our conversation tonight. I thank you so much, Winona, for taking the time to share your activism and your wisdom and your love of being a grandmother. And thank you all in the audience for being here tonight with us. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Miigwech.